As homeschooling grows at a rapid pace, we are witnessing a growing demand for free money, free materials, and free activities to make it easier. In addition to that, we are also watching state governments increase their demands on homeschooling parents in the name of protection or academic rigor. The freedom to educate our children at home is such a basic parental right, but that's still controversial in many circles, especially those who view government as the giver of liberty. Homeschool freedom has only existed for the past 30 to 40 years in America, and with the growth of homeschooling comes more threats to that freedom. Today's show is all about education freedom and education subsidies. And we're going to talk about the differences in those. And I'm joined today by Lauren Gideon of Education Independence to discuss the current threats to homeschool freedom and what we can do about it. I'm Nikki Truesdale, and this is the Nikki Truesdale podcast. And my favorite thing in the world is to equip parents to bring their children home from public school and educate them with a biblical worldview. I was homeschooled in the 1980s, and I've been homeschooling my kids since the year 2000. I've also written 2 books on homeschooling, including Anyone Can Homeschool, which actually came out of the whole school choice movement. I blog extensively at nikkitruesdale.com and offer one-on-one consultations. This summer, you'll find me at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Convention in Denver and the Arizona Home Education Convention in Phoenix. And because I'm also a history buff, I republish old American history books like old diaries, autobiographies, eyewitness accounts, and many more. I really believe that we should get our history from the incredible people who made it and not the Marxists who are working overtime to destroy our heritage. My next book is coming soon, which is an illustrated guide to busting the myth of separation of church and state. Check out Knowledge Keepers Bookstore for all of these books and the ones that are to come. Well, as a second-generation homeschooler myself and the child of parents who were arrested for homeschooling in the 80s, I'm very passionate about the topic of homeschool freedom. Today, I'm talking with someone who is just as passionate. Lauren Gideon is the Director of Government Relations for Classical Conversations. She has been a home educator since her first student was born 20 years ago. She homeschools her 7 children. She co-led community classes on our nation's founding documents and civic responsibility. That's my favorite. I wish I was in your classes. And homesteads with her husband in Iowa. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
I'm so excited to be here, Nikki. I can already tell we have so much in common and we could probably talk all day. So this is a delight. Thank you for having me.
Yay. Well, you and I are definitely on the same page about homeschool freedom. We both believe it is the right, a basic parental right of parents to raise and instruct their children in their home if they choose without the permission of the government or the intrusion of the government. We believe that education is not the government's department, period. And that's not as popular as it used to be. So I want to quote a little something from one of your blog posts to get us started. And you said school choice and education independence are not the same thing. And confusing the two could cost your family freedoms that took generations to build. So I want to start with the topic of education independence, which, like I said, is a basic parental right. So can you define what that is to you?
Yeah, education independence. Those words were chosen on purpose because they find they're nested within the ideas of American independence, that individuals have responsibilities that the state should not trespass on, and governments are instituted to protect those responsibilities and rights from being trespassed on. And the reason why we have responsibilities is because God gave those responsibilities to us, and anything that God gave us a responsibility for, therefore we have the right to that thing. And so education, I just call it parenting, to be honest, right?
Yeah.
We in the homeschool space, one thing we like to say, and this came from your introduction there about biblical worldview, is education is just discipleship, right? We're raising the whole child, mind, body, and soul, and every child will be discipled through the process we some people call education. It's just a matter of what are we discipling those children into. And so, uh, primarily, I think that God gave that role and responsibility to parents.
Amen. That's what I always say too. Education is discipleship, and also homeschooling is just parenting with school supplies. That's the difference, and it's so much simpler to when you realize that. I'm always talking about trying not to recreate public school at home, and that's for that reason that you are just parenting, and it's not two separate things. You don't have to be a teacher and a parent. You're just a parent, and you're supplying your kids with all the knowledge that they need to become a functioning adult. And it's definitely our right. It has always been our right. And I think people also forget that the government school system, as we know it, is very young. Um, it's very new. We were here first, the parents who educated their children at home. They didn't call it homeschooling in the past, but that's what people did for centuries. And, the only thing that changed was the government got bigger.
Yeah, I always make the argument, like, we're not doing alternative education. Government education was the alternative. That's the deviation from the status quo, which was parents, taking ownership and responsibility, and that looks different, right, from household to household, so it's not a cookie cutter model, but the idea is parents are going to have this role and responsibility, which means they're going to make choices, and within responsibility, comes the funding component too. We intrinsically know this. So you asked about education independence. So it's saying we have to keep this thing separate from the jurisdiction of the state. We already fundamentally know that about other topics. You brought up separation of church and state. We understand certain things must be kept independent because of the sacredness of what they are. We know that about speech, religion, association, all of those things that we have codified to say these things ought to be independent. And education isn't outside of those things, it actually nests right there inside of those other protections as well.
That's that's exactly right. Well, before we jump into some very specific issues, can you tell my audience what you do as the Director of Government Relations for Classical Conversations?
I would love to. So Classical Conversations, God has just blessed that organization, that company as a whole to the degree that they have grown um, across our country and in 53 other countries as well. And so something to that size will be impacted by public policy. And so we have the joy and the privilege of either taking the posture of being reactive or thinking about how to be proactive and being good stewards of the liberty God has given us within this context of this great country. And so, my goal is to, in my role of director of government relations, said, well, how ought we should do that? And because we live in a republic, my heart and soul is for the people of this country and saying, a Thomas Jefferson quote is, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never can be. And so our success, our sustainability as a country rests in the constituents governing their country well. And so my heart and passion is always going to be in the grassroots. And so what that looks like, practically speaking, is how are we going to encourage and equip the grassroots of our country, starting with our homeschool families, perhaps, because we'll start with what's closest to us, and perpetuate ideas grounded in truth, so that way we can go forward and steward our country well. Now, naturally, it's not all truth in my world. I specifically deal with the principles of education freedom. Where do those come from? How are they best exercised? And what does that look like pragmatically in the country that we live in?
Okay. So, on that note, I want to talk about homeschool freedom, or as you call it, education independence. Um, it is one of our most basic parental rights. And one of the things that I say, which does not go over well a lot, is that we have such a basic freedom in this area that even if a parent did not send their child to public school and also did not provide them an education, they're still within their rights as a parent to do that. Um, However, that's not what I advocate for at all. I'm all about a really solid education and rigorous academics, but on my terms as a parent. But my point is, the government has no say in how a child is educated, really. They think they do, but they don't. But we're still seeing this idea that government has to decide how your children are raised, and that really impacts homeschoolers because really these many states overstep their bounds when they first step in and try to tell you what kind of education to give your kids. They also move into other areas of parenting that they certainly have no rights for. And one of those most current stories, I think, right now is happening in Connecticut. So, can you explain a little bit about what's happening there for someone who is not aware?
Yes. I will start by saying we live out of the worldview that we have. And so what we're seeing is a clash of diametrically opposed worldviews. The question of who is responsible for the children is probably the question at stake. It's not how should one exercise that responsibility, maybe as much as who has legal jurisdiction. You're going to predicate that claim on something. The worldviews in conflict are one where God gave parents a role and responsibility for children, or the alternative right now is the benevolent, all powerful thing that gives and takes away is the state, and everything exists to serve the interests of the state. So you'll probably know that as Marxism, totalitarianism, some other worldview, and we don't always acknowledge that. It's by your fruit you shall know them, right? So sometimes we see these things and you're like, well, that's a random thing. You're like, no, 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 right? You're going to trace that tree back to the branch, back to the trunk, back to the root where it comes from. It's not a deviation from the path. It's the fruit of the path that we've been on.
Mhm.
So we're seeing a paradigm where if we were to say the jurisdiction of parenting of children is like, if we said it's like your front yard. So the question is, does that belong to the property owner? This is going to sound crazy. I'm not comparing children to property, right? Or is that jurisdiction belong to the state where they can just knock over your picket fence, come stake their flag right in here and say, no, we have the rights to this thing. And that's what we're seeing is this assumption that the children belong to the collective. And so therefore it's the state's best interest to steward their role and responsibility of the children. And it turns out you can't have that. Either the parents own and direct the parenting, or the state owns and directs the parenting. And so this case we're have this paradigm played out in policy where the state is in charge. They can give permission to parents in this worldview. They can give permission to parents to be agents of the state, to bring parents or to raise children. But parents don't fundamentally have that. Okay, so practically it means that this policy is that parents on a regular basis are going to be giving an account, not to God, to the state. And so they're going to say, oh, benevolent state, may I continue to homeschool my child for another year? Do you have eyes on my child? Do you think that I'm doing a good job? And now this is going to involve in-person checks. There's all sorts of accountability measures. And one of the most egregious aspects of this policy is that if a parent decides mid-year to take their kid out of school, as I understand it, basically, we're going to check with CPS. We're going to make sure that the parent, this is how it's being presented. We're going to make sure that the parent deserves first to, or allowed to homeschool before we give them permission. And so, I think most narrowly people see this as an affront to parenting, which it is. But ultimately, this is an affront to the American experience and the American way of life because it's undermining our complete system of the presumption of innocence, due process of law. All of these big ideas are also on trial with this philosophy of the state being the parent in Connecticut and having that being posed on the homeschool community, which is a sad reason why this conversation came to be in the first place, because ultimately the state failed at what it was supposed to be doing in some sad, tragic cases with children. And instead of addressing the state's failure of exercising its role well in those spheres, they have decided to turn their attention to the homeschool family and usurp parents and their authority in the homeschool space.
Yeah, it generally does start with something like that, just I don't like the word random for this, but I would say a random case where a child was neglected or abused and they blame it on homeschooling when um, homeschooling doesn't abuse children. Abusive parents do, or abusive teachers do. Homeschooling never abuses anyone. It is just an education method, as we've talked about it in a different place. And I do think 100% of the time, like you said, the right to be innocent until proven guilty is missing in these because uh, I interact with people on X, which is probably the most volatile place where you can discuss homeschooling, and overwhelmingly, the people that do not support homeschooling always assume that every parent who doesn't send their child to school must be hiding abuse. And I
Mm.
just think, have you actually met any homeschool families? Because that's not the case at all. There are cases where people keep their kids out of school and abuse them and use the term homeschooling, but I guarantee you in most of those cases, there was no education happening anyway. It was
Well, I
a very
completely agree.
unhealthy person.
Yeah. I think that goes back to the worldview. If you believe it's in the state's best interest to raise a child and you are ruining that plan, there was
Yeah.
some sort of infringement, right? So
Yeah.
it's back to that worldview issue.
I agree completely. It is all back to the worldview. So, there are many cases that pop up, like the one in Connecticut, randomly, not randomly. It is orchestrated. Um, but they vary throughout the United States, depending on the state where it happened. But I have not looked into this part, but can you tell me offhand if what is that organization that is basically trying to, the Center for Responsible Home Education, are they involved in this case?
Yes, they were from the beginning. One of their testimonies in the original, they had a joint public hearing, and one of their testimony givers was associated, and I believe their resources were leveraged as well in this. And I think that's they have an advantage in so much that they leverage the human compassion that God gave us to look at a situation and say, well, why wouldn't we um, want to intervene if there is legitimate harm? Um, but they are part of, I look as I stand back and says it looks like there is a national effort to
Yes.
rechange how public society views homeschooling. There's a New York Times book at the beginning of the year, a concerted
Hmm.
effort to reframe homeschooling as not parents taking ownership and responsibility and going the extra mile for the education, or but that this is explicitly harmful to children.
Yes, I actually did a podcast on that New York Times article earlier this year. Basically, they asked the question, are homeschoolers abused? And
Mhm.
it's easy for people to grasp onto a headline like that and go, oh, yeah, I'm sure they are, without knowing the facts. And like you said, it's changing the narrative. And the Center for Responsible Home Education, that name, like the Affordable Care Act, is just a lie. It's the exact opposite of what they're about. And you can usually find them at the beginning of any threat to homeschool freedom.
It is, and it's not different from any other social issue. I would say probably like gun safety, right? You're going to find a
Mhm.
crisis and you're going to leverage that to assert that the state has a responsibility to step in. And so
Yes.
I on one hand, I think we are probably a primary target right now. On the other hand, it's like, well, we're not special, and we can step back and look from the conversation at large to say, how do we fit in the broader picture of understanding liberty and justice?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, I want to switch over to talking about school choice. And in the beginning of this, I talked about um, we're talking about education freedom and
Mhm.
education subsidies. So I just want to clarify for my audience, education freedom is just the right of parents to educate their kids in any way they see fit without regulation or restriction. Education subsidies is when the taxpayers put the bill for that education, whether it's your kid or not. All taxpayers are paying it. And So, just for those who are new to this idea, new to homeschooling, new to education funds, can you define school choice for us?
I would love to. I can't talk about it with also talking about the shifting vocabulary landscape as
Yes.
well, though, because you used the word education freedom. I was actually in the room with a bunch of school choice lobby individuals where they said it is now our official agenda to rename school choice as education freedom. You're like, whoa, 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 we just lost that word too? Like choice. There's a lot of words being leveraged to write a narrative. And so I like how you explicitly are distinguishing freedom from subsidies. And school choice, I think, historically has leveraged a shifting landscape on equivocation of terms. So back when I first heard about school choice, and I was actually a leader in classical conversations, we were shipped yellow scarves. The narrative, as I understood it at the time, was we promote legal options for all families to educate in a form that they choose. And so
That
we
sounds
don't want
good.
any legal restrictions, right? And so it has been over time then that that narrative have shifts. Not are we providing a legal option or let's say unshackling a legal option because the state doesn't give us freedom anyway, right? They just stop preventing us from being free. Now the narrative has shifted is now we think every family is entitled to have their educational needs funded through compulsory a wealth redistribution model, and every family is entitled to that. There's some of their slogans is like, "We don't think a family should be restricted by their zip code." All sorts of
Yes.
slogany things to shape a narrative that by nature of you being a child inside the state that you live, you are entitled to the per pupil funding amount that the state has decided. And so that's a very different thing than a legal option to guaranteed having that funding there. And that distortion, I think, or that equivocation, this right to this thing is uh it affects the education space, but it's actually redefining how Americans view rights on the whole,
Yes.
because we have completely shifted by saying you have the opportunity to pursue whatever you pursue. Now you have the opportunity to have somebody else pay for that, and if you have the right to something you didn't earn, that means we are now normalizing the fact that other people lost the right to something they did earn.
Yes. Or as I like to call it, socialism. You described school
Yes.
choice in one of your recent Facebook posts in a way that I think is one of the best for people that don't understand. You said, think food stamps, but for education, but with no requirement of financial need. And I think that's very apt because um, it is welfare. School choice
Mhm.
funds, whatever name they come under, there are many now, it is still welfare. It's education welfare. And except that in many cases, you don't have to prove that you need it. Like in Texas, they just passed our school choice bill last year, it just went into effect this year, and you just apply. And it's not necessarily based on need. It's just
Yes.
kind of a lottery. So,
And the problem or the opportunity here is, uh, we are 100 years into a model where this has been normalized. So when I call education or savings account education welfare, right, people are, like, offended because for 100 plus years, we've been normalizing this idea that the community at large is going to pay for individual education needs. And so it's just shocking then to use that language and saying, "This is a giant wealth redistribution scheme." We're just like frogs in pots where it's been slow and it's been normalized for so long that we are uncomfortable calling it for what it is.
yes. And by the wealth redistribution scheme, you're going back to the beginning of the actual public school system, too, not just this new invention of, it's not a very new invention, but the idea that we should also fund everyone's homeschool and private school. We should never have been forced to fund everyone's public school, and that's an idea that is still mind-boggling to a lot of Americans. Like, school is American pie, that's
Yeah.
just what we
Yeah.
do, but it's not American pie. That's not what made our country great, and it surely didn't make education great. I mean, all we have to do is look at the statistics and realize that that's the case. But like you said, it's been a way of life for so long now, for a century, that we just think this is normal and it's good.
It goes back to
So,
that, like, "Buy your fruits, you shall know them" thing, and so we're now seeing the fruits of what I'll say a socialist model for education funding looks like. This is not people think, "Oh, education's off the tracks." Well, you and I both know if you've read the history of government education, it's not off the tracks, it's reaching its intended definite destination. And so that's where you and I were very passionate about the private sphere of education. We're saying all of the things that caused harm, where we see this education model, we don't like what's happening over here. We don't think it's a coincidence. We think, it finally reached its destination or it's getting to its destination. Please just don't bring that into this sacred space that we have protected over here from this socialist funding model that came with all of the things it came with. And so it's not that, I mean, uh, that's really not my battleground really is public education so much as it is like, look and see the difference. Please don't bring that over here.
right. That's a good point. I get asked that too. Why don't you go and try to make public schools better? That's what I get all the time. And I just say people have been trying that for decades and it's not helping. It's not doing anything. Getting out of the government system is the only kind of help there really is. And so, like you said, that's not my space. I'm not there. I'm not at the school board meetings. They don't listen to you. And so it's such a behemoth now that there is no turning back. And so the best option is to get out. But they've found a sneaky way to get into our education after we've gotten out. So I want to talk about school choice and the problems with it. And when we talk about school choice, I want to be very clear. I'm using the term that they are using that means taxpayer funded, specifically home education, but it also includes private schools too. But our podcast today is about home education. And so when I use the term school choice, I'm using it with air quotes because we already had a choice before the government decided to help us. Um, but it can be called an ESA or a freedom account, whatever clever name your state has come up with, it's all the same thing. It's basically like a voucher, but if the state is paying for your homeschooling, that's what we're talking about. But there are many problems, and I thought it would be good to go by the objections that we normally hear and kind of attack each one individually. So, one of the top ones is, hey, this is optional. You don't have to take the funds if you don't want to. So, Lauren, what would you say to that?
I'll tell you what I say. We live in the freest country of the world. Everything available to us is an option. In fact, if we choose communism, we have an option to choose communism. Just because we have an option doesn't mean all options are good. We could vote ourselves into all sorts of um, horrible government, totalitarian. So options in itself aren't all created equal. It's the right and responsibility of free people to choose good options. That's step one. Just because it is an option doesn't mean it should be an option for us in our worldview. The second one is, again, I actually will holler to the pro-life argument. Okay, so people say the same thing about abortion. Just because it's legal doesn't mean you have to make that choice. But what we know, I think it was a slogan, is abortion takes away the choices of the unborn.
Yes.
So, if your choice takes away the choice of somebody else, maybe it wasn't yours to be had in the first place. Now, on a much lesser degree than life, right? Your choice to take one of these accounts or subsidies of whatever it is means that somebody else has to pay for that. People live in this paradigm, well, the money's already there, or we've already taken the money from people. But the reality is you have a choice whether you're going to be a consumer of other people's hard-earned wages or if you're not. That is within your realm of something that you can take responsibility for. And so there's that layer. And then also we have to think of a generational impact. The choice that you make is setting economic consequences for the future for people that go just beyond you, and philosophical paradigms will have implications of your choice that affect more than just you. So it's a really hard to make the argument that this is just it's just somebody's choice. It won't affect anybody else.
Yeah, anything that comes from the taxpayer's pocketbook affects everyone because, even in the small town where I live, there's arguments about funding street repairs and parks and things like that. And what the city council will say, oh, we got this grant money. Okay, that grant money still, or they'll say that's federal, it's state money. It's not, you're not being taxed. And I think, who are these people that think that all that money is not taxed? We are the ones paying for every bit of the taxpayer money. So
Yeah,
I think people
right.
just like to block out, well, I didn't write a check for it, so no, I'm not the one paying for it. But yeah, you
It's
are.
in your beginning statement too, we were talking about this perception of we want free education, and I think that's what you're talking about right now. It's like we use this
Yes.
word free, but we know nothing's free. Somebody somewhere is going to pay for it, either now, in the past, or in the future. Everything will be paid for. So we're just either punting that to somebody else, punting it to the future. But yeah, there's no free money. There's no free lunch, right?
Yeah, like you said, we're frogs in a pot, and it's a long, slow boil because now, no one alive remembers a time when you paid your taxes with a bill and you sent the money. It's just automatically deducted from everything you make, everything you earn now. And so it feels like it's not happening. I mean, I notice when my kids get their first job and they get their first paycheck and they go, What happened to all my money? I just wish that painful experience would last a lifetime for everyone. And they go, What happened to my money? Because now, like you said, we just call everything free.
Well,
And
and we have the extra layer of everything being politicized right now. And so, on one hand, we might just think, money makes itself, which not we're just saying it doesn't. The other thing is like, well, there's a race to see which political agenda can outspend the other, right? So if we think that the state okay, right, there's this pool of money, and the argument is if we can take it and spend it faster than the other guy, then society will be better, or whatever the paradigm
yeah,
is. And so now it's like this death spiral of saying which political paradigm can outspend and outsteal more money.
yeah. I just want to remind everyone here that elections matter, every single election at every single level. But let's move
It's
on
so
to the
true.
next common objection from people who think everyone should have this school choice money. Shouldn't I be allowed to use my own tax dollars in any way I like? What do you say to that one?
Well, I said define your terms, right? I'll start with that. What is your own tax dollars? Could you imagine, Nikki, if we had like, well, here's your road voucher,
Yep.
here is your EMS service voucher, and like, here's your military voucher. This is your portion of the military budget, and you can decide, like what?
You hire a
No, let
soldier. Yeah.
that's nonsensical in any other space. So, as a collective society, we're a republic. So, under God, the people rule. So, the highest office holder is the people, and we elect middle management and we give them a job. We say, we want these things, and we want you to figure out how to allocate the public funds for those things. So, when I'm taxed, it goes into the public pot. The public pot belongs to the collective, and collectively, we decide how to spend that through our elected representation, and we elect them to spend that money well. And I think this is an important piece of the school choice conversation, because how does one spend other people's money well? Well, they're going to have so much transparency. Like, you need to see where every dollar goes, because people like to steal money. So you have to be really careful. It's corrupt. So to have transparency, we're going to have accountability for every dollar that's not ours that we're spending. We're going to make sure we're accountable back to the public for how that's spent. And then we're going to regulate it too, because we want to make sure that we have the best outcomes, the highest ROI for the public's money, because in our process, those people that's spending it are going to give an account for those people, and those people are going to decide, do you keep your job or are we going to fire you? We have a performance review every time we have an election, right? And so that mechanism is the thing that we use to be good stewards. And
Mm-hmm.
so, number one, back to your point, is when it's belongs to the public pot, we lose our individual right. Now we're using our collective right to steward that money well. And number two is in the education space, all of those mechanisms of fiscal conservatism are thrown out the door because we're saying freedom. I don't have to give an account. You don't need transparency or accountability or regulation or fiscal conservatism because I'm entitled to this. And so everything we know about fiscal conservatism gets thrown in the trash when it comes to education freedom dollars, or I'll use quotes, education freedom dollars.
Yeah, what I always tell people is that if you feel like the government has money that is yours to spend, maybe you think they shouldn't. Most people fall into the category, it seems like, well, they took it from me, so I want I want that back on a voucher or whatever. But really, I think the solution is to attack taxes, to continue to vote for people who will possibly lower our taxes, but the only way that happens is by lowering spending. And so
Yes.
we've got a whole country of people that are not making that connection, like stop the spending and then the taxes will go down. I think we're seeing some of that in rooting out fraud in this administration right now, which is encouraging. But it needs to happen nationwide on every level, state, county, and city. If we stopped spending money like crazy, like I said, even in my town with these grants, then the taxes would just automatically or should automatically be reduced. And
Yeah.
elections are the way to make that happen.
Absolutely, right? Because they're the middle management. For the
Hmm.
sovereign, the people are the middle management. We have to do good performance reviews, which requires a lot of work on our part. I'll also address the fact that a lot of people just maybe there is just some math deficiencies, but but mathematically, this idea, like if we were to say, I'm just getting my money back. Okay, so you'd have to do some math. You'd say, well, how much am I paying in taxes? What
Yes.
is percentage of money going to the education spending of my state? So how much could I legitimately claim is my money? I have 7 kids. I think you said that in part of your introduction. Let's say if I was in states like Arizona, I think they started with a $7,000 ESA. So easy math, let's say I'm getting $50,000 back. So I know not all families are as big as mine, but um, I could not make the claim that I'm just getting my money back. Mathematically, it's a check. And so I've even done some math here in Iowa last session. They proposed this idea. This is a new wave, and we can go here if we want to or not, but of a refundable tax credit to the tune of $4,000 per child that could be advanced. And I was just doing some math, and so what do I know? My state budget education funding is about 50%, and I know a median family income and a median family tax um, liability. And basically, at the end of the day, I think 80, like 12% of it they could claim that was their education dollars coming back to them. And what was the rest? And like 88% of that was actually other people's money coming back to them, if you do the
Yes.
math. So
Yes.
that school choice is thriving in the environment of unchecked claims.
Yes. Well, in my state, and I'm in Texas, I have 5 kids.
Uh-huh.
When this was first really being pushed, it's been going on for at least 10 years now. And at the time that it first really started ramping up, all 5 of my kids were still home and homeschooling. And they were proposing around $4,000 to $5,000 per child. So I was like, wow, that's $20,000 to $25,000 for our family this year. We don't pay that in education taxes per year. So that, like you said, the math is very simple to figure out when people say that's my tax money. Why don't you look at your tax statement and see what you pay? Yeah, let's abolish the property taxes and let's fund education a different way and then keep it every year when you get paid. There is a way to have your tax dollars, and that's to have them stop taking it in the
It's
first place. And then you'll
exactly.
see how much it actually should be, which is It depends on where you live and your house and everything, but I've never paid $20,000 a year for school
No.
taxes.
No, and then so then they go the tax credit route and saying, "Well, give me my money back," which you're right. The only right way to do this is to stop taking it in the first place.
Mhm.
But so then we're dabbling in the field of special income tax credits, which is very
Yes,
interesting. I think we're predicating on the fact, well, I'm not a consumer in the education system, therefore I shouldn't have to pay into it. Well, if that's the case, that claim could be extended to anybody that's no longer has kids in their house, to grandparents, to a dual income family, no kids. So if we believe in
exactly.
equality and justice for all, that's in our pledge, right? Justice for all, it would mean that that same degree of decreased tax liability was be extended to everyone, but that's not how this plays out. It's only given to families that have school-age children.
Yes. It's very not equal. It's the best best I've got, but yeah, it's not equal, and so then the grandparents who have no kids at home or the people who never had kids in the first place should be saying, "Wait, what about me? I want my tax dollars back for something too." So yeah, it's
And if
it's
we don't go
definitely
if we don't
very
And if we don't go
oops,
that path, what we're doing is codifying this idea that education is a responsibility of the state. If you're not saying it's not right based on the fact that I'm not a consumer, we're saying, well, the state has a responsibility to fund all education. So they'll do it through ESAs to the family or whatever form or to the government schools. And we're back to the worldview question and saying, the consequences of this worldview have had consequences. We can see them all around us, and that's the paradigm then we're inviting into the homeschool and private school area.
yeah, amen. All right, so the next objection, these are the objections I've gotten over many years. I'm sure you've gotten the same ones. Don't you know that not everyone gets a choice? What about the poor kids? What about the inner city kids? Shouldn't they have a choice? What would you say to that?
I would say define choice. I think what you're saying is we have a means-based problem. And
Yeah.
means-based problems don't just affect education, they affect everything. And so I think scripture uses the word poverty to describe people that have a means issue. And so I would say if the scripture has addressed that issue, we should see what the scripture says. And it talks about, the church, the family of faith, the community stepping up to saying, when people have needs, this is how we go about. This is the right way to go about. We're gonna outgive our government anyway. I mean, ideally, if we're obedient to Christ's command to be generous, and the recipe is never under compulsion, voluntarily, because God loves a cheerful giver. So
Yes.
we have to wrestle with the fact that we're never going to be progressive enough to advance past a society that has people that don't have needs. Christ said, "You will
Right.
always have the poor." And you can have poverty, you have means deficits in all sorts of areas. And so the question isn't if we're going to have people that have means issues, it's going to be what is a biblical way to go about meeting the means issues that people have.
I actually did an article several years ago about how you can help, just the general public can help someone homeschool. And to me,
Hmm.
that's the way you actually give people real school choice. It's through the private market, through personal charity, like you said, even churches who want to make this part of their mission. But you don't have to wait for the government to pass a law and give a voucher to a select few kids when you could do something. That's what I always say. You go do it. Whether it's giving them a ride to a better school or you maybe tutoring them in your home. I've been there, done all that stuff. I've had that stuff done for me. The homeschool community is often very kind and generous, and that's what all this government intervention is overlooking is just private charity and just, calling someone saying, "Hey, does your child need help with math? I'll be their teacher," or "I'll give your kids a ride to co-op every week so that they can get there," or whatever it is. There's so many ways to do this through private means. And again, that goes back to looking at this. It is welfare. It is a government subsidy. And too often, even the church has just fallen back on that.
And the model you're describing leaves people's dignity intact because we're giving gifts. We're not subjugating them into a government program. We know the history of government programs has not um, always helped society grow past the need. It usually entraps them in programs and keeps them from agency and independence and dignity. And so this is the way we can love people and actually free them and keep their dignity. One of my favorite books, even on this topic of poverty and education, is a book called The Beautiful Tree. And it talks about how even in the slums of India, people have found ways to work together, to negotiate, to figure out a way, because even in the slums, parents are dissatisfied with the state provided option. And they're saying, we can be creative, we can use our steward our resources to provide a better option, and they do. And so it shames, I feel like, our American culture to say, we have so much, we've been given so much. We don't have a money deficit as much as a culture, right? I'm not going to peg individual families and say they don't have legitimate needs. But as a culture, society as a whole, we don't have a money problem, we have an imagination problem. And we need to figure out how to be generous with what God has given us, to also meet those needs then of other people around us.
And I really think that describes the homeschool community, is that uh, imagination. And there's so many things that have arisen that were not in existence before homeschooling grew, which, like all the different forms of co-ops and hybrid schools. And when I try to explain to people how many ways there are to homeschool, I always think, did I remember all of the ways? Because there are so many different ways, because basically it's like there's all these different ways to shop for shoes, or all these different ways to go out to eat a hamburger. It's the same thing with homeschooling. When you get out of the public school mindset, there's so much creativity within the homeschool community. I've been blown away. I've been in it for 40 years in a very rural community in Texas, and we know, we don't live in the big metroplex cities. And we have everything, everything, because a parent was like, you know what? I have a great idea. I'm going to start
Yep.
this. And so it's
Watch
just
me.
like you said, it's just creativity and
Well,
getting
now
away.
yeah. We don't suffer from lack of choices. Sometimes we struggle from too many choices, right? Like, enough of the choices.
Yes, we need to stay home. Yeah.
Yeah.
That also happens. So yes, creativity, and then the willingness to sacrifice also
Mhm.
comes into play. Sacrifice. I always say, these are all choices. The public school system is a
Mhm.
choice. Private school's a choice.
Mhm.
Homeschooling is a choice. Not having,
Mhm.
expensive dinners out every week is a choice. What you have to choose, obviously, you have to make some
Yeah.
sacrifices. That's
I
part
just
of it.
met this homeschool family in Long Island, New York, and they were talking about the sacrifices they make to live there because of the egregious tax burden that's placed on them. But they have found they homeschool, yes, but also they're nested within a giant community of their family, and they have made an intentional decision that we will live here, we will pay the outrageous taxes here, property taxes here, because we've chosen to stay with family. And you're like, beautiful, right? You knew what's at stake, you counted the costs, and you chose in line with your convictions. And I applaud you. That's awesome.
Yes, exactly. All right, another objection is that school choice is a free market option. And I don't think that's true at all. So, would you like to address that?
I am no economics major, but I'm like, I think it's Robert Bourne says this, like, you keep using this word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I went to school a while ago, and from what I learned, a free market was free of government intervention.
Yes.
So
It's
that
that simple.
the modifier free, right? That's the thing it was describing. And so now, also, pragmatically, I understand they're trying to leverage free market principles in a non-free market. If they would just tell that and say it honestly, I would have more respect for the claim. But it is not free market, and that is not independent from state funding and state oversight. Uh,
Yeah.
the idea, I think, right, though, is they're going to use demand to shift people from one setting to another, which is
Mhm.
going to, again, those market principles. The problem is like we've played this game a couple times in the healthcare industry and the higher education history. And once you compromise the market with money, right?
Mhm.
Um, money, it does not do the thing that you think it's going to do. And it maybe once upon a time, the first time we did this, you could be like, "Oh, this is a good experiment. I wonder how it's gonna go." We can't say that anymore because it has a track record of saying, "We meddle with this, we inflate it with a ton of money. This is a predictable outcome." And so, a good idea, but it's not gonna work, and it's not what you say it is.
Yeah, I don't think you have to be an economics major to understand that if the government I is putting their money into this, it's not free market anymore. That's all. I mean, I'm not an economics major either, but that's pretty easy to understand.
That's like junior
Okay.
high level economics.
It is, yeah, yeah. So, obviously, you and I are both very anti-voucher, ESA, school choice, in quotes, funding, any government funding for homeschooling. And unfortunately, many states have gone ahead and passed this kind of thing. In my state of Texas, they just did after we fought for probably 10 years. It was pushed through by Republicans, which is confusing and infuriating all at the same time because Republicans are supposed to be the party of smaller government and less spending. Obviously, that's not necessarily true, but so a lot of states have passed it already. I'm not sure on the number anymore, but it just keeps happening. And so I predicted, and I've got this on my blog because I am happy to have someone hold me to this in a few years. But this is my prediction for what happens in these states, especially Texas. We have no homeschool law. There's a requirement to have bona fide curriculum. There's no description of what that means. So basically, we call ourselves a very free homeschooling state. But now with the passage of this is kind of what I see coming. The first, the homeschool ESA recipients will be scrutinized because they're taking the money and maybe how they educate, maybe what they're spending their money on. Obviously, that's going to get scrutinized by everyone. Next, when the state or the populace decides that homeschoolers aren't doing it right, then all homeschoolers will be scrutinized. And this is the fear that I've had since the very beginning. We'll all be lumped together, and people won't differentiate between the ones who are taking the money and the ones who are not. Then there will be calls for more oversight on all homeschoolers in the whole state. Then bills will be introduced to impose minimum requirements, assessments, and data collection. Then there may even be bills to impose medical oversight in the homes of homeschoolers because this is already either being introduced or happening in certain
Uh-huh.
states. That's
Uh-huh.
why I said they move beyond the educational sphere once they get their foot in your door, and then they want to be in charge of everything. Um, in Texas, I believe our status as one of the best homeschool states will disappear. Homeschool curriculum prices will go up. They already have in some states. Some mom and pop providers will go out of business because they won't accept the funds and they can't compete with the state's approved education vendor coupons. Also, I believe homeschool co ops that don't accept those funds will shrink, possibly disappear, while the state funded co ops will grow. And then ESA homeschoolers, the homeschool group that takes this money, will look at the private homeschoolers who don't take the money and start demanding to have the freedoms that we've had all along, which will result in what I think will be the opposite, that the free homeschoolers will be affected by the ESA law until homeschooling is no longer recognizable. What do you think?
I would say you're prophetic, but actually that seems like just math to me. Like the math checks on that, and there's reasons for it. There's a couple of reasons I think are predominantly to blame. um, we are constantly talking about parental rights being the foundation for home education, and I think that is only part of the story. Uh, I think the bigger claim for us to be left alone, metaphorically speaking, is that the public doesn't have any legal claim to come into our space. as independently private funded, right? Either through our own income or gifts from others or scholarships, free market scholarships, we are not receiving public funds. And so I can, and confident, I have a moral claim for two reasons. Say, God gave me this role and responsibility. And number two, I'm exercising this responsibility. Now, I'm going to define responsibility like contextually. I like to picture this story where I think about I have a 12-year-old. He's turning 13, and it seems to be that this 12-year-old boy between the end of sixth grade and going into seventh grade. I think that's where we're at. I'm homeschool. I don't know grades, but I'll go to put him in his clothes in the fall, and his jeans are gonna be like 6 inches too short. That's just what happens. And so I'm gonna go to Walmart, and then I'm going to pick out clothes. Right now, I know that I don't pick out clothes and just send the invoice to the state and say, I'm the parent, I have freedom, this is what I'm choosing and within my responsibility, now you pay for it. No, we understand that part and parcel with responsibility is both the choosing, the discernment, and then the funding of that thing, whatever that thing is, that's responsibility. And so in homeschool, historically, and even historically in private schools, we did the choosing and the funding of that choice. And those things together give us the legal claim to say the public has no interest here. You are not stakeholders. You are not co-owners. You do not have ownership rights. I have sole ownership rights. Well, me and my husband, right, together. We have sole ownership of the rights of this space that we've created. And so, so there ought to be a boundary because you have no jurisdictional claim to this. Okay, so what you're saying is we're going forward, that for education, school choice, they keep wanting to leverage parental rights, but they're leveraging it in an incomplete way because I have the responsibility on one hand, I fund the responsibility, which is part of the responsibility on the other hand. If we leave that one there, it's incomplete. And then the public does have ownership rights in that space, and if they're funding it, they have stakeholder rights. And so I think you're completely right to say the freedom that we have known is going to be forfeited, primarily through the fact that it's been sold. So the majority of people are selling their ownership rights for taxpayer funds, which means they don't retain those rights any longer. And then what you're also arguing, which what I agree with, is there's not going to be a distinction made. Like the idea of private property is dying, falling hard. Like even if I talk about it, people are like, what does owning land have to do with this? You know, like this is not about owning land. This is the fact that ownership in our country historically mattered. And whatever you owned, whether it's your body, your thoughts, what you write, what you say, who you associate with, and then anything that's an extension of that, which is your occupation, which is the value you receive for selling your labor, and you get money in return. All of those are extensions of yourself, and you own that self. This is the undergirding foundation of freedom. And if we're losing that, we're losing freedom on the whole. And homeschooling is just a microscopic element of that, but I think that's where the battlefront is now. So I would say your predictions are on point.
And I'm sad because if they are, it's not good for homeschoolers in any state where this is happening. I know that in West Virginia, after they passed their ESA bill, I believe they tried to start with, separating ESA's homeschoolers from the private ones. And within the next session, they introduced a bill to go ahead and impose these restrictions on all homeschoolers. And I think it got defeated, but the point is that's exactly what they're going to try to do. It may be quick in some states, it may not happen in other states. It's just the way government is. It's the way tyranny
It
is.
is. I don't always know it's malicious, honestly. Part of the fact is, like, I was the thing, never attribute to, I can't remember the word, maliciousness, what could be rightly attributed to incompetence, something along those lines, okay? But the reality is, like, we are very familiar with the nuance here, but our lawmakers, this is one of a bajillion topics they're going to cover. And so are they going to keep in mind, oh, there's two kinds of homeschoolers here.
Right.
There's going to be publicly funded. No, they're not. And I don't know how we could expect them to. They're human. And so, yes, it is happening. It's going to happen. until I'll actually even gonna push back on one thing that you said, and I think you'll agree with me actually. I don't think you and I disagree or are opposed to all of these things, because, we hate them, right? It's actually because we tasted and experienced the beauty of free market independent education. You're like, "This is precious. What you've done in your home is precious. What I've seen happen in, like, communities," and you're saying, like, entire cultures, right, of homeschoolers that are
Yes.
creative and pile their resources and work together to figure out something like, that is amazing. What if the rest of the world could even experience this? It is so beautiful that it compels us to identify these threats and saying, like, don't you dare, because what we have is so beautiful. We do not want it to be ruined and we want to protect it. And so that's why we do what we do.
That's exactly why we do this. That's exactly why we're having this conversation today, because we know how awesome homeschooling can be when it is left alone. And we don't want to have that compromised by politicians or even by citizens who demand their fair share of our tax dollars.
They just
So,
don't know.
no. Yeah,
That's why we're
education
talking.
is so there's a lot that we presented today, a lot of problems, but there are solutions. So, what would you say the average homeschool mom or dad can or should do about this? About freedom and specifically ESAs if they're offered in their state. What should we be doing?
I think, there's that scripture that says, "No man builds a barn without counting the cost," and I told you about that family in Long Island. I think it's okay to take inventory. Like I told you, in certain circumstances, I've counted how much my family could bring in with a ESA or a refundable tax credit or different things, and I'm, like, evaluating my experience within the experience of the whole. Like, for me to retain freedom or independence or sole ownership with my husband, it requires me to make a sacrifice in so much that I'm going to leave that on the table. Like, you and I probably like it's not that big of a sacrifice, but some people like the the heart like the family that has the harder needs. That sounds weird. I'm not saying that right. But the bigger the need is, the harder the sacrifice is going to be to leave that on the table. And so right now thinking about $50,000, $100,000, whatever the pile of money is, know what it is and consider, should I leave this on the table? Why should you leave this on the table? What's at stake? To me, again, I've said this homeschooling issue, this homeschool freedom issue, I think is representative of the American cause for independence as a whole. This
Yes.
represents the parent's ability to say, this is mine, this belongs to me, and for that reason, I'm going to say, stay off my turf in the nicest way possible. And that cause for independence goes back 250 years, right? That's what we're celebrating this year is the birthday of our country and this cause for freedom, for independence, for retaining the rights that God gave us. Now, if we think of ourselves in the legacy of that narrative, of that line, the generations of freedom there, I'm thinking about the sacrifices that have been made. Some people have lost lives. Some others have lost sons. There's been entire families wiped out, not because they're greedy, selfish, freedom-loving, greedy people, right? It's because they believed in something bigger than themselves, that they're willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice and lay their lives down in that cause. Not just for the people around them, for generations to come. It's really a love of principle, of truth, and of people that they're willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice. In that context, $50,000 on the table looks like pocket change. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I joyfully leave that money at the table. It's my turn to step up to the plate and be like, what can I sacrifice for the cause of freedom at scale and education freedom and for families? My second daughter, my first daughter, she's my second child, she's getting married in July. And so all of a sudden I've been brought into this generational mindset of thinking about
Yes.
what I leave the next generation. And so my cause for freedom, my cause of independence, my cause of sacrifice for that has just grown exponentially, thinking this is my opportunity to pay my dues, to pay it forward, to respect the sacrifice that's been paid for me, and to pay it forward for future generations.
I
That's
love
step
that
one.
tie-in. Yeah, I love that because that's the way I see things too. I'm a lover of our whole story of independence in the American Revolution. And I've always said the founding fathers used the word posterity so many times when they wrote and they spoke, and they were saying what we do now impacts the generations to come. The people we won't see will benefit from what we do right now, what we sacrifice. And that's the way I see it. I have 2 grandchildren now, and, they're just beginning their homeschool journey. It's so sweet, but I want homeschooling to be free for them too, you know? My parents, who are no longer with us, went to jail for a day because of homeschooling. They were
Yeah.
arrested for it.
Yeah.
I want granny and granddad's sacrifice to matter for the grandchildren, you know? I want them to have that same freedom that we have right this second and not have it compromised by government subsidies.
Yes. So that's
I
step
totally
1, right? Is leave the
Yeah.
money on the table. Step 2 is we have to be creative and generous people. Like, it would be so exciting. I do some interactions with policymakers. I would love to walk into a state house and be like, um, our coffers are like, so we have HSLDA has a scholarship fund. Classical Conversations has a scholarship fund. I would love to say they're overflowing with so much money that we don't know what to do with. And so because of that, we honestly don't need your education welfare program. We've got it covered. Like the family of faith, the community, we have taken care of those. So I think step 2 is find a way, and maybe it's not money, right? But be generous and others minded so that we can see and meet the needs around us and not become dependents of the state. I think that is the second part of
Yeah.
maintaining this. We're and what I do with the Education Independence Network, we've dedicated a whole year to this idea of building metaphorical infrastructure of an ark, because we understand, like, the accusation at the homeschool movement is like, you don't care about the 90% of kids still trapped
Mhm.
in schools. You're like, have you come into a co-op? Have you
Yeah.
stepped foot into one of our communities? Is like, we literally exist to serve the people that have not yet even joined us. We are
Yes.
so others minded in how we go about what we do. What if we lived that mentality out loud for people to see? What if we continue doing better at what we're already doing best, is preparing an ark for people to seek refuge in, because we know the direction culture is going and we understand the way that the school system's going. And we expect more and more people are going to seek refuge in the independent education space.
Amen. I'm totally
Ah,
with you. That's the point of what I do every day is basically my motto for years has been anyone can homeschool.
yeah.
Let me show you how. It
Yep.
doesn't matter what your lifestyle is. Yes, you can do it because I've already done that. So I totally agree. That's what we should be doing now is helping the next person get out of public school
I want to
and the next.
repeat something you said earlier too, is that elections matter, right? Our ability to steward our role and responsibility as citizens in this great country and in these states matters so much. We have to take inventory of that which we've been given, our liberty and the role of a citizen, and saying, how am I leveraging this for the highest good for God
Mhm.
and for others? And so that means I said, we are I say ruling class, people get confused with that. We're the highest office in the republic. And so who we hire and fire matters. Like, they represent us, and we need to choose representation that their convictions are aligned with truth. And that matters. And that's hard work, but there is no other course option available to us as I understand it.
And a lot of people get burned voting for someone who ended up not doing what they said they would do. That happens. People are humans. So keep doing it. Find someone new to vote for. Find someone to campaign for. Right? I mean, it's so easy to be politically involved. People think it's so much trouble. It's so easy to send an email, to send a text. Depending on the local level, you can just message someone on Facebook and they'll generally answer you. So just send your messages, ask questions, say, if I vote for you next time, what are you going to do about this? It's not that hard. Take 10 minutes out of your week and just, get knowledgeable and involved, and don't skip the elections because they really do make a difference.
Yeah, and our apathy shows, right? We have generations probably of not taking responsibility, where we have created the system. We reap what we sow.
We
And
do.
so we probably can't fix it overnight, but if we can instill a generation after generation of stewardship instead of apathy, um, you know, I don't know if we can fix everything, but that's the only course forward as far as I can see it.
We can never stop trying.
Right.
All right, Lauren, where can my listeners find you?
Thanks. So I'm part of the Education Independence Initiative. It's an initiative of classical conversations, but we exist to find friends and build bridges even outside the classical conversations family. So with homeschoolers, even genuinely private schools, we understand we all live and breathe in this space of independent education. So we have a website called www.chooseeducationindependence.com where you can find more of our philosophy, our 4 pillars of education independence. You can join and become a member there and be on our mailing list and be a part of our virtual seminars where we discuss these ideas and have so much fun in that space. Also, we're on all social media platforms as well under Education Independence, I think, on everyone. And we appreciate people tuning in, listening, even arguing, right? Because one of our pillars is we believe wrestling with ideas is good for the whole community. And so, either we will find that we have consensus or we'll find out we have an area to grow. And in learning either one of those things is good for us.
It is. And you speak at some homeschool conferences as well, don't you?
I did. I just am fresh off of a Capital Day event in New York. It was such a privilege to get to know those families in a very different education climate than I have here in Iowa or
Oh,
Texas.
yeah.
Been
Yeah,
offered.
I'm sure.
It's great to meet those people, hear those stories, but I will also be with you in Colorado here in June. So that is my next stop, I believe,
Okay,
and
mine
being able
too.
to meet families.
I look forward to meeting you actually in person now.
Yes, that'll be delightful.
Well, this has been a really, I think, really great conversation. We talked about so much more than I even anticipated. So thank you so much for joining me and for all the work that you do for homeschool freedom.
Likewise, Nikki, I know the public benefits from your commentary on all the platforms and your experience. I feel like we need to continue to hear those stories about your family, your history, and all the stories of those pioneers that fought for the freedom that my generation has gotten to experience and the generations coming up after us. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdell.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com. And find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.